أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال إنما يتقبل الله من المتقين. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلى على محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. There's a philosopher, a political philosopher by the name of Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived in a time which was very, very much turbulent. Politically, it was a very turbulent period where the church was being separated from the state. Now the church, if you read the history of how the church ruled over the people, you realize that the people had enough. And what they did was they began to lead revolutions against the church. The end outcome was that the church was naturally separated from the state, meaning that religion was completely separate from politics. Machiavelli, living in this period or in this time, developed a philosophy, a political philosophy. He was one of the founding fathers of political philosophy. He presented a case, or he presented a particular formula. And this formula, it's a very contentious formula. Initially, he presented this formula, this idea, to create a reformation on a political level. But you find that what's interesting is that this particular formula has been so embedded within our societies that we all tend to believe in it, especially within secular society. Now, when the church was being separated from the state, what happened 200, 250 years ago, the ramifications of which we are seeing within our society. What he presented was the end justifies the means. So he came forward and presented a notion explaining that if on a political level there is something which is significantly morally good for the people, regardless of how you materialize that objective, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, everyone benefits. The people benefit, the nation benefits, and everyone is happier. If by necessity a person has to commit evil in order to reach that good, then so be it. The end justifies the means. For him, he said that political power, leaders of society, instead of nurturing and allowing their people to grow morally, they should focus more on realistic concepts, such as looking after them, catering for their well-being, prioritizing on their security, and so on and so forth. So morality no longer played a role in such discussions of a political level. It was all about having objectives and making sure those objectives materialize and actualize. And you find that this concept of giving priority of utility more so than morality is something that has been embedded within our society, in secular society specifically. So he came forward and he said a good leader is a leader who has objectives and he is able to materialize those objectives regardless of the discussions surrounding morality. Now what's interesting, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now what's interesting is that this particular concept that the end justifies the means is a very contentious issue. It's a contentious issue because not many people are willing to admit to it. So when you look at what's happening on a global level, not just within European societies or within, for example, North America. When you look at the political states and leaders and how they are ruling, they very much follow this particular ideology. So about 20 years ago, when the SOS was asked the question, you took the military, you went towards Iraq and you did what you did in Iraq. You had an objective, but in the process of materializing that objective, 500,000 children were killed. It was a famous clip that was spread in media or throughout different media channels. Her response was very, very clear. She said, yes, I promoted it and it was justified. Why? The reason being is because the end was morally good. We had to dispose of the dictator of the time. If in the process we ended up killing 500,000 children, well, the end justifies the means. Because the end goal was to develop liberation for the people of that country, to develop democracy, and so on and so forth. When you look at, for example, collateral damage, this gives rise to a question with regards to collateral damage. When there is war between two nations, naturally there is collateral damage. Women and children are affected, many of whom are killed. Does the war justify collateral damage? The idea of the word, the term collateral damage shows that this is an inevitable thing that takes place when two nations go to war. But it's justified. Why? Because the end goal is much more noble, it's much more morally strong than the means to achieve that objective. When you speak about, for example, torture, we see this on a daily basis, for example, in certain media channels, that certain individuals are tortured to seek information and to extract information from them. Again, when you bring in morality, is it justified to torture someone to extract information from them? Now, the idea behind this is, as cases are presented, the more complicated the case, the more complicated the discussion becomes. So, for example, and this is something that was researched by some other researchers, and their publications are spread throughout the internet. They came forward and they spoke about COVID. They said, look, COVID was handled in a specific way. We all went through a period of lockdown where each and every single one of us were obligated to stay within the house or within our homes. Why? To make sure that we do not spread the disease to other people, to make sure that the safety is preserved within society. But on the other hand, researchers came forward and said, but there were other things that emanated when people were locked down or when people were in lockdown. For example, COVID was maintained, but at the same time, domestic violence was on the rise. Divorce cases were on the rise. Child abuse was on the rise. This is something that was examined by researchers. They said, for example, people did not have access to medical services. So all of the potential people who had cancer, they were undiagnosed. So there was a rise in cancer rates, and so on and so forth. So you realize that when people were in lockdown, there was an increase in drug abuse, there was an increase in mental health illnesses, and so on and so forth. So when you bring all of these different factors into the conversation, it's no longer black and white. You can't then therefore come forward and say COVID was a good thing, the way it was handled was good, because you have all of these negative ramifications that were associated with it. So, because this case is complicated now, the discussion that is associated with it becomes complicated as well. On an individual level, this philosophy affects us on an individual level as well, how we behave. If there is an objective that I have in my mind, does it mean that I can do whatever it takes to materialize that objective, even if it's morally wrong? So for example, mundane example, if I was to lie on my CV to get a job, is that acceptable morally? It's a very simple example. But then you have to consider other factors which again make it very, very complicated. If I was to lie in my CV in order to obtain a job, I've just taken away someone's right who is better suited for that job than I am. Perhaps it may affect him greater in comparison to me if I was not to get the same job. Maybe it would destroy his life financially. Maybe there are people who are dependent on him and he needs the job more than I do. So this simple lie has now materialized into something big because it actively affects someone else's life. Or for example, Robin Hood. What's the concept of Robin Hood? When you steal from the rich and you give it to the poor, right? When you have someone who is a tyrant, someone who is an oppressor, is it morally justified to go and steal from them and to then distribute the wealth amongst the poor? Again, does the end justify the means? Regardless of how noble or how morally good and strong the end is, does it justify that I can do anything I want in order to materialize that objective or no? When we bring in the religion of Islam, you see, this is something that has to be reverberated, and I've mentioned this in the previous lectures. The religion of Islam is very simple in explaining that the human being naturally is weak. When it comes to understanding what is real and what is not real, when it comes to our understanding of what exists, we've mentioned this, the aql can only take us so far. The aql tells us that what is physical and tangible exists. But then revelation has to come in and explain to us that there is more to reality, there is more to existence than what you and I perceive. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, Allah says in the Holy Quran, we have created man weak. And because of this weakness and deficiency, man is always reliant upon revelation. Morality also has a discussion in this place. The Aql explains that yes, there are certain actions which are good and there are certain actions which are bad. In fact, we don't even need the religion of Islam to tell us what's good and what's bad in certain aspects. For example, murder is bad. We know this. We don't need Islam to tell us that killing someone else is bad. Stealing likewise is bad. Lying is bad. Justice is good. Being kind is good. Being compassionate to others is good. But then there are certain actions which the aql will not be able to understand whether it's good or not, upon which it is necessary for us to refer to revelation to outline for us what exactly is good and what exactly is bad. I'll give you an example. Establishing a family. Establishing a family, Islam has a specific guideline that if a person wants to establish a family, it has to be done through marriage. Now, if you establish a family without getting married or without marriage, the outcome is still the same. You have a partner and you have children. The only difference is one was done through marriage, the other was not done through marriage or outside of marriage. What's the difference, physically speaking? The aql would not understand what the difference is between the two. But when revelation steps in, revelation says that there is a spiritual paradigm that makes the two cases absolutely different from one another. Physically, they're both the same. The end outcome is exactly the same. Except on a spiritual level, it's very, very different. When you have two dishes in front of you, they weigh the same, they taste the same, except one is halal and the other one is not. The aql is not able to understand why one is better than the other. Revelation has to now come in and say that on a spiritual level, there is a massive difference. There is a great difference between the two. And so on and so forth. And you can come up with many different examples and so on and so forth. So, revelation is necessary for us to refer back to. The reason being, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. The reason being is because the human being is weak, not able to understand what is true and not able to understand what is good for us. When it comes to this particular philosophy, does the end justify the means? Revelation steps in and tells us that no. The general rule that has been presented within the Quran is that the end does not justify the means. Which verse? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the story of Habil and Qabil. When Allah told both brothers that they have to give something as sadaqah, Habil comes forward and he gives one of the best herds that he has, one of the best cattle or animals that he has in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Qabil, on the other hand, what does he give? He gives a few weeds here and there, rotten weeds that were dying. In the end, Allah accepts the qurban of Habil but rejects Qabil's offering. And in the end of the verse, Allah says, إِنَّمَا يَتَكَبَّلُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْمُتَّقِينَ. Indeed, Allah takes from the muttaqeen. This verse is a very powerful verse. Allah accepts the actions of those who have spirituality, those who have taqwa, those who are wary and cognizant and acknowledge the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of a sudden Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating a standard for us, that we have to be spiritually strong for our actions and our a'mals to be accepted by Him. In other words, Allah is saying that when it comes to morality, the muttaqi will never do something which is evil in order to achieve something which is good. And the idea behind this is that evil can never beget good. By committing a crime, a divine crime or a spiritual crime, the human being will never be able to achieve any good. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. They say during the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, now the Sunnis have this hadith within their books, the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but they refer it to other companions. Within our sources, it's referred to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. They say there was a man in the city of Medina who was very well known for his altruism, for his generosity, and the people praised him. So the Imam said to himself, you know what, it's actually quite nice to meet a person who is altruistic. Why don't I go and see him? So when the Imam was going to see him, to see what exactly this person does, that the people, to such an extent, the people are praising him, he decides to follow the person. So in public, the Imam follows this person. He sees that one day the person goes to a baker. As soon as the baker turns his back, he takes 2 loaves of bread and he hides them away in a bag. So the Imam is a bit shocked. This person has just stolen 2 loaves of bread. He says maybe perhaps he will come back later on and pay them off. So he continues to follow the man. The man goes into the market. He goes to one of the grocery stores. As soon as the shopkeeper turns his back, he takes 2 pomegranates and he hides them in his bag as well. So the Imam is shocked again. Okay, hold on a second. This person has just stolen 2 more things. Maybe perhaps he doesn't have the money. He'll come back and repay them later on. So the Imam continued to follow him, and the person then went to one of the beggars in Medina who was sick at the time. He then gave him all of the 4 things, the 2 loaves of bread and the 2 pomegranates. So now the Imam is very much questioning the morality of this person. So he approaches the person and he says to the person, he said, look, what you've done is wrong. Now the person responds back to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He says that I've heard that you are the son or the grandson of Rasulullah. Is that true? Imam says, yes. He says, well, if you come from the lineage of Rasulullah, I'm actually shocked of your deficiency in knowledge. So the Imam says, how so? He says, well, look, if you observe the Holy Quran says that those who give, Allah will reward them tenfold. And those who do bad, those who commit an evil act, Allah will hold them accountable with 1. So if a person does a good deed, Allah will magnify that by 10. And a person who does bad, Allah will keep it as a single sin. He said, I've stolen 4 things, so that's 4 deeds or 4 misdeeds in my account. Whereas I've given away 4 things, so I've been rewarded with 40 in return. That makes my account come down to 36. When the Imam heard this, sometimes when communicating with a jahil, the Imam, the morality that they have is quite remarkable. So the Imam responds back, he says, listen, that's not how it works. It's not as black and white as you've demonstrated. He said, with respects to the ayah of the Holy Quran, what you've done is you've performed a level of ijtihad, but at the same time you've ignored a different ayah of the Holy Quran, that Allah only accepts from the muttaqeen. By necessity, the standard that Allah has developed here is that the muttaqi in the first case scenario would never steal in order to do something good. That's something that you lack. You cannot be identified as a muttaqi if you're going ahead and stealing from other people. Number 2, he said you didn't commit 4 good deeds and at the same time commit 4 misdeeds. You stole 2 loaves of bread, you stole 2 pomegranates, you gave away 2 loaves of bread and you gave away 2 pomegranates. All of it is a sin. So the man asks, he says, me giving it away, how is that considered to be a sin? The Imam replies, he says, you gave away something that does not belong to you. If it doesn't belong to you, you do not have the right to give it away to someone else. So when you bring in this concept this idea, stealing from someone to help another person who is more in need, the end does not justify the means. This was according to the philosophy of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Beyond this, and you have to realize this is a general rule that has been preserved. This is a general rule that the Quran is presenting. Any rule that the Quran presents, there are exceptions to it. And these exceptions are outlined and they're presented by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam as well. Everything, this is a common thing that we come forward and we observe in life. You have a general rule, but then you have exceptions. Now, because you have exceptions, it doesn't mean that the general rule should change. They remain as exceptions. So within our fiqh, there are exceptions to this rule, where the end outcome does justify the means. And this is something very, very rare or something very specific. That's why the fuqaha, when they present these examples, they are very much unwilling to expand this rule for other areas as well. So they limit it within these examples. So for example, let's say, as a man, I'm walking down the street and I see a woman drowning in one of the lakes. Now this woman is a mahram. She can't swim, she's drowning. What do I do? Do I say to myself, you know what, I can't touch her, I can't save her? Or do I jump in and save her if I have the capacity to do so? So now you're faced with two situations. It's haram to interact with a woman who is a mahram, but it's wajib to save her life. So what do we do in this scenario? The hakim al-shar, the authority would step in, revelation steps in and says that, look, you are facing two very important issues. What is more important is to save someone's life, which takes priority over the other concept, which is the interaction with a mahram. It becomes your responsibility to preserve the life. Likewise, if a woman is in cardiac arrest and I can give a CPR, I can administer CPR. Do I ask myself, well, I can't touch her because she's a mahram, I can't interact with her on a physical level like that, should I let her die? Say no. The religion steps in, revelation steps in and says that this woman has to be saved because saving a life has a priority. I'll give you another example. Lying. Lying is evil. Yes, each and every single one of us believe that lying is evil. To present something that does not correspond reality is evil in itself. But at times lying becomes permissible. When you are reconciling two brothers, when there is a quarrel, when there is beef between two brothers who are unwilling to speak with one another, you as a mediator are willing or have the ability to lie so that they reconcile, so that they mend their relationship. Lying is evil in all cases, but in this specific case, it becomes permissible, it becomes a good thing. The reason why these are allowed is because we have narrations from the Ahlul-bayt explaining to us. Can I therefore apply this in different dimensions of my life and say, well, the end outcome is good, therefore allow me to perform something which is evil that lets me reach that particular end outcome? It doesn't work that way. That's why the fuqaha are very, very much unwilling to expand this rule beyond what has been preserved and what has been maintained by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. One example is presented within the Holy Quran. The interaction between Nabi Allah Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr alayhi salam. And this is a very beautiful story that summarizes this whole concept, this whole philosophy. Does the end justify the means? Musa, when he comes towards Khidr, they go on a walk. Continuously Khidr reminds Musa, he says, Musa, I will do certain things, you will not have the patience to bear and watch what I'm doing. Musa says, well, let me observe and I'll decide for myself. Khidr goes ahead, he comes towards a boat. He damages the boat. He creates a hole in the boat. A perfectly normal boat. Khidr alayhi salam damages the boat. Then they continue walking. Musa is now questioning. He says, why did you damage a boat? It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to someone else. What right do you have to damage the boat? He says, Musa, did I not say that you will not have patience to what I do? Musa silences himself and they continue. They come across a wall. He rebuilds the wall. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Then he comes towards a child. What does Khidr alayhi salam do? Khidr kills the child. When Musa sees this, now he's questioning the authority of Khidr alayhi salam. How can you go ahead and kill a child? This is a crime that the human mind cannot understand, to take away someone's life just like that. So he questions the wisdom of Khidr. He says to Musa, Musa, did I not tell you that you will not have the patience to bear what I'm doing? And then he explains to Khidr, he explains to Nabi Allah Musa alayhi salam. He says, with regards to the boat, the king of the land was going around confiscating the assets and the properties of his people. He was an oppressive king, taking away some of their assets, their properties, taking away the people's rights. When the king, when he approaches this specific boat and he sees that this boat is damaged, he will not touch it. It's repairable, but he will not touch it because it's damaged. So the owners who are in need of this boat, they will come and they will repair the boat and they will be able to use it like normal. With regards to the child, he says, I have been given wahi by Allah that this child cannot live, because this child will grow up to be an oppressor, an evil person. Does the end justify the means? This was a very specific scenario, an exception in itself, because we are speaking about prophets who have direct access to revelation. A few nights ago, I asked the question, how do we seek knowledge? The answer that we said was knowledge is acquired. The acquisition of knowledge refers to our five senses. And then I asked, is there any other way in which we can acquire knowledge? Well, if you see philosophy, if you see the philosophy of secular society, they say no. Knowledge can only be acquired through the five senses. According to the religion of Islam, according to the hadith of Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. He identifies, he says, ilm is not something that you read and memorize and go over and over again. He says, ilm in nature is a nur from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a light from Allah. When Allah sees that the heart has the capacity to hold the light, then He will permeate the heart with that specific light. In other words, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is explaining that when a person goes through spiritual refinement, his heart, his qalb becomes a recipient of special knowledge that is given directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So yes, according to the Islamic paradigm, according to the Islamic worldview, it is possible to acquire knowledge, not with regards to dunya. We're talking about wisdom, knowledge which is nafi', knowledge which is beneficial directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is an example where the end justifies the means, but this is a very rare example. Why? Because this is an interaction between prophets and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we come to the madrasa of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala from the very beginning of his life, you'll find that there are certain instances or certain events that take place within his life where he demonstrates this particular philosophy, that the end does not justify the means. The end does not justify the means. Regardless of how powerful and how good the end is, evil cannot be the route to materialize that specific end. And I'll give you a few examples that were shown during his life. The first of which was shown when the Shura was taking place. Umar ibn al-Khattab died, and he left 6 individuals to choose from amongst them the new caliph or the next caliph, the successor. When you read the books of history, 4 candidates were dropped out from the Shura. The only 2 that were left was Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam and Uthman ibn Affan. One of the conditions that Omar had placed was that if there are 2 individuals who are competing with one another with regards to the caliph, then Abdul Rahman ibn Auf has the final say. He has the authority to choose who the new caliph is. So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf approaches the Imam alayhi salam. This is significantly important. He says, we are willing to give you the caliphate. but there are conditions to it. We will nominate you, we will support you, but there is a condition. What is the condition? You follow the Kitab of Allah, the Book of Allah, you follow the Sunnah of Rasulullah, and you follow the Sunnah of the Shaykhain. You follow the Sunnah of Abu Bakr and Umar. Now understand the ramifications of this. Amir al-Mu'mineen could have easily said, sure, why not? But then after, he could have retracted his statement and say, well, I've thought about it, but maybe perhaps following the Sunnah of the Shaykhain is not a good idea. The Imam could have lied in order to capitalize on the caliphate. When he becomes the new caliph, he has all the authority. He is no longer obligated to follow the Sunnah of the Shaykhain. So he could have easily lied, take control of the caliphate. If the Imam had taken control of the caliphate, the Bani Umayyah would have never established themselves within the Muslim Ummah. Can you understand the ramifications of all of this? If the Bani Umayyah had never been given power in the first place, Karbala would have never taken place. The whole annals of history would have taken a different turn altogether. If Amir al-Mu'mineen had simply lied and said, sure, I'll follow the Sunnah of the Shaykhain. When you look at, for example, the policies that were enacted by Uthman ibn Affan. You see, Uthman's caliphate, historically speaking, is very, very interesting, especially some of the things that he enacted and some of the things that he established. The level of oppression that came about, that emanated from the Muslim lands, was phenomenal. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam could have deterred all of that from happening. The disturbance, the imbalance, the disequilibrium that was created or could have been created. When you look at the Caliphate of Uthman, first and foremost, he established the roots of the Bani Umayyah. You find, for example, the likes of Marwan ibn Hakim. Marwan ibn Hakim was one of those individuals who was exiled by the Prophet of Islam. You know, the Quran, when the Quran describes the Prophet, he says, Rasulullah is rahmatul lil alameen. He is the manifestation and the embodiment of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What level does a human being have to be for him to be exiled by the Prophet? Considering the fact that the Prophet is the most merciful creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There were people who would betray the trust of the Prophet, and the Prophet would welcome them back with open arms. What type of a human being would need to reach a level where he is physically exiled by the Prophet, where the Prophet has to say to him, leave, there is no place for you in Medina. When Uthman becomes the caliph, he reinvites Marwan ibn Hakim. Why? Because they were cousins. In Ziyarat Ashura, what do we say? We give la'na on the Al of Abi Sufyan and the Al of Marwan. Marwan ibn Hakim, after the demise of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, his son Muawiyah comes into power. He doesn't rule for very long. Then the family of Marwan take over. And this is when the oppression towards Imam al-Sajjad, Imam Baqir alayhi salam, was manifest. All of that could have been deterred. When you look at, for example, the financial crimes of Uthman ibn Affan, nepotism was on the rise. He supported his family. The Bani Umayyah were now being enriched. You have, for example, personalities who were now benefiting from the public treasury. The money was not going to the people who needed it. It was going in the pockets of his own family members. To the extent that the people of Egypt rose against him. The people of Egypt came towards Medina and they stood in procession outside of his palace. They were on the verge of killing Uthman ibn Affan. Who stood in and protected Uthman? It was Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Alongside him, his two sons, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhim salam. They stood there protecting the gates of the palace so that the people, the crowd, the anger that was present amongst the hearts of the people, that would then eventually lead them to kill Uthman ibn Affan. They controlled entrance. No one could go in, no one could come out. The food was regulated. Selected food types and water was then given to Uthman ibn Affan. Until one day, one of these individuals was able to enter the palace and he murdered Uthman. All of this could have been deterred if Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam simply said to the person, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, sure, I'll follow the Shaykhain. A simple lie in order to capitalize control over the government. Yet Amir al-Mu'mineen, he stands there and he says, I will follow the Kitab of Allah, I will follow the Sunnah of the Prophet, but I will not follow the Sunnah of the Shaykhain. He refused to lie. Why? Because the end does not justify the means. A person can never engage in seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through disobedience. A simple lie in the eyes of the Imam alayhi salam was magnified to such an extent that capitalizing on the government and on the caliphate, it wasn't worth it. Second example, in the Battle of Siffin. The Battle of Siffin, right towards the end, Amr ibn al-As, Muawiyah, they make a decision to take control or to take Qur'ans and to place them over the spears. 500 copies of the Qur'an were taken and they were placed on the spears. And the idea behind this was if the army of Amir al-Mu'mineen were to attack the army of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, when they would see the Qur'an, they wouldn't attack because the Qur'an is sanctified. In the end, the Battle of Siffin ends in an arbitration. There is no winner, there is no loser. It ends in an arbitration, a form of contract or a peace that was then established between the Imam and Muawiyah. When the Imam returns to Kufa, slowly the people begin to speak about how weak he is. How weak he is as a leader. They begin to praise Muawiyah because of his intelligence, because of his smartness. And then they insult Amir al-Mu'mineen. The Imam sits on the minbar. As a reaction, the Imam sits on the minbar and he delivers a sermon. He says, Wallahi ma Muawiyah to be adha minni. Don't go around saying and believing that Muawiyah is more smarter than me. Muawiyah was smart, but he was cunning. He used his intelligence for evil. He says, Muawiyah is not much smarter than me. Muawiyah is not smarter than me. وَلَكِنَّهُ يَغْدِرُ وَيَفْجُرُ. The problem with Muawiyah is that he has no red lines. He will do whatever it takes. Any act he is willing to commit under the sun in order for him to fulfill his objectives. Morally, immoral, it doesn't matter to him. There are no standards. He's not disciplined. He's not principled. With regards to me, if I had the same traits as Muawiyah, you would see me better than Muawiyah. It is just that I am principled, I am disciplined, I do not engage in acts which are immoral. The end does not justify the means. The brother of the Imam alayhi salam, Aqil, when he visits the Imam, he sits down with them. They are on the roof of the palace, or the roof of the governor's residence. They're talking away. Aqil had a problem. Number one, he was in debt. Number two, he was poor. So he came to the Imam. The Imam is the Caliph. He came to the Imam. He came to his own brother for help, financial help. He hadn't eaten in days. So he comes to the Caliph of the Muslim Ummah thinking that, look, I've been invited for dinner, and dinner's going to be good because this is the king's dinner. As dinner comes, Aqil looks at the type of food that the Imam is eating. And then he questions, says, this is the food that you eat? As the king of the Muslim empire? And then they carry on in their discussion and he says to his own brother, he says, I have come because I am in need of help. Financial help. Can you give me a loan? He says, how much do you need? He says, 100,000 dirhams. He says, that's a lot of money. I don't have that type of money with me. What I can do is the stipends, when they come from the Bayt al-Mal, the public treasury, I'll give you my share as well. I'll give you your share and my share. He says, I can't wait that long. This debt has to be paid immediately. He's very unwilling. The Imam refuses to give him money from Bayt al-Mal. Aqil tries to convince him, you've got a lot of money within Bayt al-Mal, give me just 100,000, I'll repay it back as much as I can over a short period of time. There's a lot of back and forth going on between them. Aqil is trying to convince the Imam to give him money from Bayt al-Mal. The Imam flat out refuses. In the end, the Imam says to Aqil, he says, do you see that box over there in that street? They're on the roof. He says, do you see that box over there? He says, I do. He says, go and open the box. You'll find your money there. So Aqil asks, he says, who does that money belong to? He says, all of the people who own the shops in the area, they take all of their profits and they accumulate it within this box. They place it in this box. I'm sure you'll find 100,000 dirhams easily in that box. It's like a safe. The safe was unlocked. There was no lock. This was the security during the time of the Imam alayhi salam. So Aqil replies, he says, well, hold on a second. You're not willing to give me from Bayt al-Mal, but you want me to go away and take the money of the hard-earned workers who have secured their money in that box, knowing that no one would take them. You want me to steal from them? The Imam responds, he says, exactly. What makes money being taken out of Bayt al-Mal any different from you taking money from that safe? That money doesn't belong to you. That's there in that box on the street. Likewise, this money in Bayt al-Mal, it does not belong to me. You know, today the politicians, when they travel with the people around them, yes? The entourage that they have, and they make sure that their entourage are dressed nicely. The people that they hang out with, they make sure that they're noblemen. They have a standard that they have to preserve. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam is completely different. And then in the end, the Imam says to him, he says, stealing from one person or stealing from millions of people, to me, it's the same. If the money does not belong to me, I cannot give it away. When we speak about Muslim ibn Aqil, do you know Muslim ibn Aqil, there were two circumstances in the whole saga of Karbala. If he was to behave with one action, one immoral act, the whole saga of Karbala would have never taken place. Karbala itself would have never taken place. In fact, the Imam would have enough power to rise against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the Imam would have dethroned Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And I say that with conviction. Why? Because Yazid was a child who was given the seat of power. He wasn't like Muawiyah. Yazid wasn't smart. He was a child. And he made many mistakes. He only ruled for 3 years. They say that when Muslim was sent to the people of Kufa, and you have to understand, Muslim was raised and he was nurtured under Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And this was a person who had absorbed the teachings and the principles of his uncle Amir al-Mu'mineen. To the extent that Imam Hussein alayhi salam refers to him as my brother and my wazir, my representative. He goes towards Kufa to nurture the votes of the people, to nurture the allegiance of the people, to nurture an army that would then eventually support Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. When he enters Kufa, he goes and he stays in the house of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. When the people find out that he's in the house of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, one by one they come towards the house and they pay allegiance. 18,000 people gave allegiance to Muslim ibn Aqil. He then sends a letter to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he says to him that 18,000 signatures have been nurtured. Come, they are willing to support you. Their hearts and their resources are at your, they're with you. They will support you. So the Imam alayhi salam slowly moves towards Kufa. At the same time, Ibn Ziyad enters Kufa. When Ibn Ziyad enters Kufa, he goes to the governor's mansion. He dethrones the current governor and then he delivers a public speech. He says, Yazid ibn Muawiyah has now appointed me to be your ruler. I'm willing to establish justice and help those who are in need. But if you get in my way, imprisonment, you will be sanctioned or you will be killed. The threat was delivered. No one is to help Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. No one is to help Muslim ibn Aqil. News reaches Ibn Ziyad that Muslim is in the house of Mukhtar. Now, there was a bounty on the head of Muslim ibn Aqil. So Muslim understands this. He secretly leaves the house of Mukhtar and he goes towards the house of Hani ibn Urwa. When they reach the house of Mukhtar, Ibn Ziyad imprisons Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. So Mukhtar is now chucked into prison. Muslim escapes and he goes to the house of Hani ibn Urwa. Hani ibn Urwa was an old man, one of the noblemen of Kufa. He's buried where? In Masjid al-Kufa. He was one of the martyrs who is also associated with the tragedy of Karbala, alongside Muslim ibn Aqil. So he stays in the house of Hani ibn Urwa. At the same time, they say there was a man by the name of Sharik al-A'war, or Sharik ibn al-A'war. Now Sharik, for those of you who do not know, he was alongside Ibn Ziyad. He was part of Ibn Ziyad's entourage. So when Yazid said to him, go towards Kufa and rule over Kufa, they left Basra together. Ibn Ziyad, Sharik ibn al-A'war, and a few other men. But deep down, Sharik was a lover of the Ahlul-bayt. He worked for Ibn Ziyad, or he was alongside Ibn Ziyad, but he had affinity and love towards the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. So he hid his faith from Ibn Ziyad. So they left Basra together. They say that Ibn Ziyad was so adamant in reaching Kufa very quickly. Along the route, Sharik becomes tired. So he asks Ibn Ziyad, he says, look, we need to rest a little bit, a few hours, maybe a day, and then we'll carry on. Ibn Ziyad refused. He said, no, we have to carry on. We have to continue until we reach Kufa. So Sharik said to Ibn Ziyad, why don't you go ahead? You go ahead, let us rest, and then we'll catch up with you. So Ibn Ziyad reaches Kufa, Sharik reaches afterwards, a few days later. When he reaches Kufa, he goes to the house of Hani ibn Urwa. They were relatives, so he goes to the house of Hani ibn Urwa, he sees Muslim ibn Aqil there. He tells Hani, he says, exhaust your resources, support this man because Yazid has to be dethroned. Now, one of the days, what happens? Hani becomes sick. So when Hani becomes sick, Ibn Ziyad is given news that Hani is ill, so he decides to go visit Hani. Hani was a nobleman. He was one of the noblemen of the city of Kufa. So a messenger is sent to Hani. Ibn Ziyad will come to you in a few hours to come visit you because you're sick and whatnot. So now they're plotting amongst themselves. Hani, Sharik, Muslim. When Ibn Ziyad comes, there is no security with him. When he comes, we will kill him. Imagine if Ibn Ziyad was killed at that moment. The people of Kufa would have supported Muslim. Muslim would have taken them towards Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. Now Imam al-Hussein would have had an entire army and they could have all risen against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Hani objects to this. He says, he is coming to visit me. He is my guest. No one is to be murdered in my house. So he objects. Ibn Ziyad comes, Hani hides himself. Sharik is there. They speak for a while and Ibn Ziyad leaves. Few days later, they say that Sharik himself became sick. Now when Sharik becomes sick, Ibn Ziyad again comes to the house of Hani to meet Sharik. Remember, they're comrades, yes? They're friends. So as what friends would do, they would visit each other when they're sick. Ibn Ziyad decides to meet Sharik. Now, when the messenger tells Sharik that Ibn Ziyad is coming to meet you, Sharik plots with Muslim. But without telling Hani. Say, look, Ibn Ziyad is coming the second time, or for the second time. When he comes, Muslim, take the opportunity and kill him. Don't think about it. Just do it. Kill him. So they planned, they plotted. Muslim, he hid himself in a cupboard, in one of the closets that was there. Sharik was bedridden for a while. Ibn Ziyad, he comes and he sits down. Then they began speaking. They engage in a dialogue. All of a sudden, Sharik tells his maid, bring me some water. Now this was an indication, it was an ishara. He had told Muslim, when I ask for water, come out and strike him. So he tells his maid, Salma, he says, bring me water. So Salma goes and she fetches some water. But he's waiting for Muslim to come out and to strike Ibn Ziyad. Muslim doesn't move. So he repeats, Salma, fetch me some water, louder, so that Muslim can hear. Muslim doesn't do anything. The third time, Salma, fetch me some water. I am thirsty. Quench my thirst. Muslim doesn't do anything. Then he begins to act very erratically. His movements are erratic. They're not normal. Ibn Ziyad realizes that something's going on, so he quickly gets up and he leaves. One of his servants, Mahran, he nudges Ibn Ziyad. He says, look, we have to leave. So Ibn Ziyad agrees, they get up and they leave. When they leave, Muslim comes out of the closet. Sharik is like, what happened? You had an opportunity. Muslim replies, he says, I have heard the Holy Prophet say that whoever has Iman in their heart, trickery and deceit will not be part of their actions. Never, I am not the type of person that would be willing to kill someone through deceit or trickery. The end would have been completely different. Karbala would have never taken place, but the means to that end, it's not justifiable. It says, if I engage in a battle, the person knows that I am engaging with him. I am not the type of person that would strike someone from behind. That's not who I am. I am a person who has Iman and Taqwa, and this is in correlation to the message of Rasulullah. The end never justifies the means. In the madrasa of Amir al-Mu'mineen, likewise in the madrasa of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, a person can never seek the pleasure of Allah through disobedience. Regardless of how morally right the objective is, it can never be sought through evil. They say eventually Muslim was captured. The army was sent. He fought as much as he could. They threw stones, they threw spears and arrows. They struck him with their swords. They threw him into a ditch. They say his teeth were broken. Then they dragged him to the palace of Ibn Ziyad. And they took him to the roof of the palace. When they took him to the roof of the palace, Muslims saw that one of the guards, he had some water with him. So he asks the guard, allow me to drink some. So they placed some water in a cup and they brought it to Muslim. Muslim then takes, or he attempts to drink from this water, but then the blood contaminates the water. He then sends it back. He says, please give me another one. They bring him a second cup. He's about to drink. He sees that the blood, it contaminates the water again. He sends it back. The third time, he attempts to drink from it, but he couldn't. The blood contaminates the water 3 times. This is when Muslim realizes, this is when he understands that his fate is to die in thirst, just as how this was the fate of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, when he was slaughtered alongside the Furat, thirsty. Then there's a dialogue that takes place, a quarrel between him and Ibn Ziyad. In the end, Ibn Ziyad orders that Muslim is to be executed. They approached Muslim, they struck him on his neck. Beyond that, they say Ibn Ziyad ordered that his body is to be thrown from the roof of the palace. Then they tied his legs and dragged him into the streets of Kufa. They say that when Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, he had reached one of these makans, not too far from Karbala, Al-Tha'labiyya. When he reaches Al-Tha'labiyya, a group, eventually they came towards the Imam alayhi salam. They say to him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, we've come from Kufa, we have news for you. The Imam says to him, what is it concerning? They say to him, it's concerning Muslim ibn Aqil, but we wish to speak to you privately. The Imam looks at his companions and he says, no, whatever news you have for me, you will also share it with my companions. They said to him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, when we left the city of Kufa, Muslim had been beheaded and they dragged his body in the bazaar of Kufa. Alongside him they dragged the body of Han ibn Urwa. When the Imam hears the news of Muslim, Rahimallahu Muslima, inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. He begins to recite these verses. Then he turns to Zainab alayhi salam and he says, Ya Zainab, bring me the daughter of Muslim. Hamida, she was a young girl. She came towards Abi Abdullah. The Imam began to show affection towards her, kindness more than usual. She begins to cry. She says, Ya Aba Abdullah ibn Rasulullah, why is it that you show me such levels of affection as if I have become an orphan, as if I have lost my father? Tell me what happened to my father. Abu Abdullah responds, I am your father now, Ya Hamid. My daughters are your sisters and my sons are your brothers. Hamida cries out, Wa abata wa shahida wa muslima. But we say to Abu Abdullah, Ya Abu Abdullah, when Hamida lost her father, she was there alongside her. But who was there alongside Sugaina when you were not there? When they slaughtered you on the 10th of Muharram, they say that when the enemies burned the tents and looted the belongings, Sukaina ran towards her father. Then she returns after a while. She says to her aunt, oh my aunt Zainab, when they did what they did to us, burning the tents and taking our things, I sought refuge to my father. When I saw his body, oh my aunt Zainab, I saw his body showered with arrows. I saw that they've severed his head. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. ماتم حسين.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya